Starting it. Well, good morning and Shabbat Shalom and welcome once again. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, and this is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. I'm so glad you could be with us. This morning, we're joined by my dear friends and teachers, Rabbi Sherre Hirsch, who this morning is actually at the American Jewish University, and Rabbi Marc Gellman, who's in his home in South Florida. We're delighted to have both of you once again to learn Torah with us together. This morning, we move into a new Torah portion, Parshat Ki Tisa. Now, this portion is an interesting one. I think I pointed out last week. The book of Exodus is perfect. That is, it's perfectly apportioned. There are 4 Torah portions which tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and then 2 Torah portions, they function as a sort of fulcrum of the story, which talk about our presence at Mount Sinai and God's revelation at Mount Sinai. And then 4 Torah portions at the end of Exodus, Truma and Titzaveh and Vayakel Pekudei, which are mirror images of one another. They tell the story of the construction of the first Jewish institution, the first shrine, the Mishkan, in which God will live among the people for the duration of the journey and for the duration of history, actually. And therefore, the Torah of Exodus is perfect. It's a perfect symmetry. 4 Torah portions at the beginning talk about God's intervention into human history, God's role in redeeming the slaves, God's revelation of God's power in human history, and God's morality. 2 Torah portions codify that morality into a set of commandments. And then 4 Torah portions tell the story of how God's presence is represented by a symbol. God's presence is represented by an institution that the people can carry with them forever. V'shachanti b'tocham, and God can live in the midst of the community. It's a perfect symmetry, except for one problem. There's an 11th Torah portion, and that's this one. And it's stuck in right between Truma and Titzaveh, in which God gives all the commandments about building the Mishkan, and Vayakel Pekudei, in which Moses fulfills all the commandments of building the Mishkan. So this is very consciously stuck in to the story at a place which is critical. And right here, the 11th Torah portion, as they used to say on Sesame Street, one of these doesn't belong. And this is the one that doesn't belong. And it genuinely feels like it doesn't belong. Because the whole story is about the obedience, the loyalty, the consonance of heart that the people Israel have with this God who has redeemed them. And now given them all these commandments, and their response only was Naseh v'nishma, you tell us what to do and we're going to do it. And right in the middle of that story comes this Torah portion about a sin. And it's not just any sin. It is a doozy of a sin. It is the great revolt, actually, against God's divinity. So let's take a look inside at the Torah portion. I'll put this up on the screen so that you can see where we are. Go up just a little bit higher here. This is the 32nd chapter of the book of Exodus, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain. So Moses has gone up at the mountain at God's command to receive the 10 commandments and to receive all of the commandments of Torah and all of the instructions for building the Mishkan. And he's supposed to be up there for 40 days, but 40 days is a long time. And they get impatient, these people. The people gathered, and the Hebrew is al Aharon, which literally means on top of Aaron. So the translator has given us the word against Aaron. And Aaron's role in this is going to be very suspicious. Is he complicit? Is he sabotaging their plan? What is his role in this? And they said, come, make us a God who will go before us, for that man Moses, what a phrase, who brought us out of Egypt. We don't know what's happened to him. He's an 80-year-old guy, and he climbed up this quaking mountain, and he hasn't come down, and we're afraid he's dead, and we need someone to be ahead of us. And notice what they want. We'll talk about this in just a moment. They want a God because that man Moses isn't here anymore. So you can see the way they're looking at Moses. And Aaron said to them, take off the gold rings that are in the ears of your wives and sons and daughters and bring them to me. And they all took off their gold rings. And there's a very sly midrash which says that Aaron thought that would impede the process because he didn't think they'd give up their gold, but they brought all the gold and they give it to him.
And there's a midrash that the women didn't hand it over.
Well, that's a better midrash, right? That's exactly what it's for.
Right, that Aaron suspected that it would delay because they wouldn't hand over their jewelry, and the men immediately handed it over, but the women held on to it. Just a little.
No, that's the reason why I give my wife jewelry every time that she has a birthday or an anniversary.
Well, one could make a joke and say Jewish women should never let go of their jewelry. Or what I actually think is a better midrash is it was about women should be accountable to the money because they're better managers of it.
Or they're more loyal to the principles of faith. Or that they saw something deeper. They saw something wrong with it was the men who asked for the idol. The women were perfectly fine waiting for Moses to come down, or the women were perfectly fine finding their own way across the desert. Right. And it was the men who were freaked out that Moses had disappeared. Well, they take off the gold rings and they brought them to Aaron, and he took from them and cast it in a mold and made a molten calf. Molten, what it means is it wasn't solid gold. It would have been too heavy. It's a wooden frame. It's a wooden shaped object, and you hammer gold leaf on it. Because gold leafs when you hammer it. It's very thin. And they exclaim. Now listen to the pronunciation, because it's very critical, right? They say, "This is your God Israel who brought you out of Egypt." And when Aaron saw it, he said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival of the Lord." So what is the difference between those two statements? For Aaron, the golden calf was not God. The golden calf was simply a representation, a symbol, very much like the Mishkan, like the Ark of the Covenant that they're about to build, also out of gold. It's not that God is the Mishkan, or even in the Mishkan. It becomes a place where one meets the divine. But the people see the object as divine. They see the object as something holy, something otherworldly. And so what idolatry consists of in this circumstance is that the symbol is taken instead of the thing it's supposed to symbolize. Joseph Campbell, the great folklorist, once said, it's like going into a restaurant very hungry and trying to eat the menu. Instead of seeing this as a symbol, which is how Aaron saw it, the people see it as something divine. Itself, it's God. Itself, it has some sort of power. And that becomes the great sin. So before we go on to the rest of the story, let's stop a moment. Talk to me about this sin of idolatry. The Bible over and over and over again warns about, castigates, persecutes idolatry. What is idolatry? And why is it so very bad? And why is it something that the Bible is so dead set against? Why isn't it just a mistake? Why is it a sin and not simply an error? What's the moral or the mortal sin in idolatry? Sherre, you want to begin?
Well, I was going to let Marc give the traditional understanding, and then I wanted to add to that. So I'm going to actually defer to my colleague.
Marc, what's so bad about idols?
Well, philosophically, theologically, what's bad about it is it confuses the created with the creator. Instead of seeing things as created, as built by humans, it sees them as actual representations of the divine. Campbell and others, Mircea Eliade, made a distinction between signs and symbols. And it's very, very important. The difference between a sign and a symbol is that a symbol takes the power invested in it and transfers it to something abstract. For example, the cross in Christianity is a symbol because it's not an idol. They don't worship the cross. They see the cross as the symbol of Jesus's death and resurrection. And a sign is something which keeps the power in itself, like the calf, or like the pagan idols that were castigated in the Bible. And that's the traditional understanding. And why it's so devastating is that the fundamental biblical understanding of God is that God is the Boré, the creator. And in the case of idolatry, it's denying the creatorship of God. That's why idolatry is bad. It leads you away from belief in God. And in a religion which has tried desperately over 4,000 years to instantiate, to develop, and to articulate the idea of an invisible God, idolatry says, no, you can worship something that's visible because you need that. And there is a deep human need to have something visible to worship.
So I would say that was very nice, Marc, that they weren't replacing God because they really didn't understand God. What they were doing was they had made Moses God, and therefore the calf was a representation of another man or another human that had disappointed them. And the idol was not God. They had made Moses already their idol. And I see that all the time. We look to other people to be for us what we don't feel we can substantiate on our own, right? I don't feel like enough, so I'm going to take my cues from that person because they look like they've got their whole life together. They know what they're doing. And so because they're my idol, and when you're younger and a kid, they ask you in school, who's your idols? And you're just projecting some fantasy of the kind of person you want to be onto some person that you think they are that with no factual information. And so I think the issue is more, this is really a warning about how do we not make other humans our idols, not just things and stuff.
I want to echo Sherry's idea that there's a category now in our culture, a new word. It's called influencer. And there are people who actually make a living at this, actually make a very substantial living.
Serious living.
Being influencers, because people look at them and want to be like them and have their lifestyle and vacation like they vacation and dress like they dress and party like they party. And I think this idea that I think is one more step to this, Sherre, which you said, but I want to emphasize it. It's based in a deep sense of insecurity and a diminishment of my own reason and self. Like, it's one thing to say, all right, I want to look that way because I think this person is gorgeously looking and I'd love to dress that way and look that way. But the idea that I want to adopt their lifestyle because I don't feel secure enough in my own existence and I have to attach myself to them in order to feel secure in my own existence. I have to be like them in order to be something that's worth being. That's the great problem. And here in this story, it's fear. I'm afraid. I look out at the vast open wilderness. I look at a world of freedom where I have to make choices and there's nobody to tell me what to do. And so I need an idol. I need someone to guide me through this wilderness of open choices because I'm terrified. And the God you worship is a projection of your own diminishment, a projection of your own fear, a projection of your own insecurity. And that's, first of all, politically, that's a very dangerous thing. Morally, it's a very dangerous thing. But more than that, what it says about the self is so sad and so broken. And I think that's one of the things that God objects to here.
Well, and Eddie, what you just said is so beautiful. And I just want to echo it. It's like, I don't trust myself. I am a broken self in my own eyes. Therefore, I have to look outwards for someone to validate what is the way or the mode of which I want to live in the world. And that, to me, is like what we need to heal more than ever. And I think Judaism gives an antidote to that, right? It says, you are enough. You actually have God within you, and you should be trusted. You should trust yourself. You don't need to go find Moses, that idol, to tell you that it's going to be okay. So I do think it's a very human quality, and I also think it's a very important lesson.
Yeah, let me say something which I don't think I've ever said. I agree completely with both of you.
Wait, say that again. We didn't understand it.
I have it recorded. Don't worry.
I wasn't hearing correctly.
Don't get a swell.
I'm going to put that on a loop.
I didn't hear it correctly. It's a
But let me
meme.
just add, because I always, whenever there's a criticism that's easy, I always like to think to myself, well, is it really that easy? Or are we simply deflecting something that really is pointing at us? And let me just say, it's easy to criticize people's, particularly teenagers and others who particularly insecure in their identity. And they look at these influencers and Hollywood types, and we say, well, that's just wrong. And it indicates a weakness of character and lack of self-image. And I say, I completely agree with it. The interesting thing to me is after, 40 years in the pulpit rabbinate, I've seen it happen to rabbis who get swelled heads and who stand in front of their congregation every single week, preaching and proclaiming the truth of this and that, and some of whom are very charismatic, very appealing, and it can happen to rabbis who are leading a congregation, and which I think is a closer example to Moses. They're trying to lead people to the truth that you and Sherre both beautifully said, to trust yourself and grow yourself closer to God. But on the other hand, they're up there. They're standing up there. They're wearing these robes usually, or whatever they wear. They look like idols. And the reason is we have invested in the rabbinate. Some people have, sadly, what's called surrogate Judaism, that we worship our rabbi because that our rabbi is going to be the Jew. He's going, or she is going to act out a Jewish life that we aren't going to do ourselves, but we can admire that in the rabbi. That's another form of idolatry, which is a little less obvious and more difficult because it points to us. It's easy to point to Hollywood celebs and say, look at these people who worship. I don't even want to say their names because that would be Lashon Hara. But there's people who are trying to do good, and sometimes they get carried away with the power of standing on the bima.
Marc, what if we empowered people to be their own rabbi, right? Because what you said is so true. It's like, I defer my Judaism to you, Rabbi, because I don't think I'm a good Jew. So you handle it for me, which is a statement about me. And what if we said, what if we took that whole dialectic of good and bad out and we empowered you to be your best rabbi? You are your own best rabbi.
Yeah, that's right.
Then
that's
everybody
exactly
waiting
right.
for Moses wouldn't be sitting there being like, he didn't come down. We got to do something. We got to make an idol. They would say, what's my role in moving this group of people forward to the promised land?
Well, the only problem with that is people being their own rabbis can make some pretty squirrely decisions. For example, I only bring you one example. Early in the Reform movement, when the Reform Jews wanted to be religious people like Protestants and Catholics, and there was some serious talk, and some big congregations in New York, the biggest actually, voted to have Shabbos on Sunday. And some of them still have what they call Sunday Vesper services. Now, this was clearly the result, not of the rabbis, but of the people being their own developers, their own leaders, their own rabbis. And they made this ridiculous decision. Yeah, why don't we be just like everyone and have Shabbos on Sunday? So the reason that you can't totally
But you
trust
missed
those
a beat,
people
Marc.
is the decisions they sometimes make.
They didn't defer to their rabbi. They deferred to the Christians. You're just saying they made a different idol, right? You're not saying then they deferred to themselves and they made this, I'm going to empower myself to be my own rabbi. They were like, the Christians are doing it that way. We'll skip our rabbis. We'll go to the Christian priests. So that's just deferring idol.
Well, but they
Because had they said Wednesday, we would have said something different.
Shabbos. They just didn't want it to be Friday night to Saturday night.
Right, but they wanted it to be Sunday because they wanted to make the idol of Christianity the prevailing. So that's not people doing their own rabbiing. That's people just
Well, I have a
trying to
long
take
list
another
of
idol.
crazy things people decide when you let them be their own. And our Parsha gives us an example of that. Here, the people were being their own rabbis, and they decide, hey, Moses is clearly dead. Let's build something made of gold that we can worship instead. So it's not quite as simple as condemning people's worship of Hollywood celebrities.
There is a paradox here. It's a paradox that attends parenting. It's a paradox that attends teaching, education, and it's a paradox that attends moral and political leadership. And the paradox is that a leader leads, but the ultimate goal of the leader's leadership is to not be the leader, is to empower the citizen to think for him or herself, to empower the student to think for him or herself, to empower the child to make good decisions, to stand up for their values, to internalize the values. And the problem is that that means that leadership has to be very subtle and very sophisticated, because I have to lead you to not need a leader. I need you to lead you in such a way, and I have to lead you strongly enough so that you can internalize the values and internalize the sense of security that you can make decisions and then make your own decisions without the leader. And at some point, what that means is that the citizen, the student, the child is going to rebel against the leader when they're ready to take off. I mean, the image of an airplane taking off is exactly what, because at that point I say, I don't need you anymore. I'm ready to lead myself. If the leader leads too strongly, you end up with this. The leader departs and the people know nothing about what to do, so they erect an idol. If the leader doesn't lead strongly enough, the child never becomes strong enough to make her own or his own decisions. The student is never able enough to think for him or herself. And the citizen is never able to say, this is where our collective ought to be moving. The leader has to be strong enough on the one side, but ready to appreciate independence on the other side. And that takes a very subtle and a very careful style of leadership.
Well, I'm literally covering my mouth, Eddie, right now, because you telling that story, I heard the echoes of when I became 7th grade class president. I kid you not, the story is as true can be. And you went into student council and the student body president gave a whole speech. This is my first meeting. I'm 13 years old. And there's just the president of each class. And he talks about, if you really want to be a leader, you want everybody to want to run for this next year. And you want them to want to rebel against you and to be vehemently invested in leadership. And he's like, that's how you'll know you're a successful leader. And I was 7th grade. And I remember sitting there stunned by listening to this paradox of what makes a great leader. And it stayed with me my whole life. And it's so funny that you just brought it up because it's something I really believe.
I would have voted for you, Sherre. I would have voted.
The irony was that he
even
was
for 8th grade president.
Well, the interesting thing, just a sidebar of the story, the president was a guy named Brandon Lee, who was Bruce Lee's son, who may rest in peace. He was actually murdered a few years back. Oh. But he was such a leader because he carried out his father's teachings and philosophies. So when we would go to our student body class meetings every month with the student body president, I felt like I was in a master class with Bruce Lee's son. So it's just crazy that it came full circle that you just said that.
Wonderful. Let's look back in this story now, because something remarkable happens next, right? In this point, these two proclamations are made, Aaron's proclamation and the people's proclamation, and they begin a festival in front of the idol. Now, before this next verse right here, the scene changes. And now we are up in heaven, as it were, on top of the mountain where Moses is. And Moses is standing with God, with the Lord. And the Lord spoke to Moses and said, hurry down, for your people who you brought out of the land of Egypt have acted basely. And of course, the word that's so funny is your, right? This is what every parent says when the kid acts up, your kid just did this. Your people who you brought out of the land of Egypt have acted basely, right? They've turned aside quickly from the way that I enjoined them. They've made themselves a molted calf, and they said, this is your God, Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So God heard what the people said, but didn't hear what Aaron said. God didn't hear Aaron's understanding of this. And he said, and now God makes a vow. And it's a very powerful and scary vow. I see this as a stiff-necked people. This people doesn't change. I've given them all of these opportunities to become free people, and yet nothing seems to be able to free them. They are still Pharaoh's subjects, and all they've done is transposed Pharaoh onto you or Pharaoh onto me, but they need a Pharaoh, and that's not the people I want. And God says, Hanichala, let me be, that my anger may blaze forth against them and I may destroy them and make a great nation of you. I'll destroy them and you'll be the new patriarch. And the word Hanichali, let me do this. Hanichali, which is it's like a lawyer would say, if it please the court, right? If it pleases you. The Midrash picks that up, and Moses heard that word. Moses hears God say Hanichali and says, no, you can't. He realizes that what God wants him to do is to stop him. God wants him, and if anyone has ever been a parent and had a partner parenting kids, you've always said to your parent, take care of this because I know I'll do something wrong. And you step back and the other parent steps forward and Moses says, you can't do this. You can't do this because it'll be bad for your image in the world. You can't do this because you made a promise to their ancestors. You can't do this because it's not you. You're not that kind of God, right? And God says, okay, go take care of it. And verse 14, and the Lord renounced the punishment he planned to bring upon the people. God changes. God changes God's mind. Marc, does God change his mind? Is it possible that God changes his mind here?
Yeah, it absolutely is. It happens several times in the Torah. In Genesis 6, God repented for having made people, and here God changes God's mind about wiping out the people. But later on in the Tanakh, in Malachi 3:6, I, the Lord, do not change, therefore you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. In 1 Samuel 15:29, also the glory of Israel will not lie or change his mind, glory of Israel's God, for he is not a man that he should change his mind. So here's the Torah with two different, really conflicting ideas. One is that God changes, which is the older idea, because the old idea of the Bible, of the Torah and of the Tanakh, is that there's nothing wrong with changing. It's not a conflict with God's godliness or perfection. They didn't even have a concept of perfection. The one who did was the Greek philosophers, particularly Aristotle, who thought that perfection meant that you could never change, because if you changed, it meant your knowledge was imperfect. And so you had to change to be in conformity with what you recently learned. Well, that idea was impossible for the Greeks. And so because of that, they developed this idea of the Deus absconditus, the God who is above the 10th sphere and completely unconnected with the world. So this idea of God changing is really puts us back on our heels theologically. Not everyone cares that much about this, but I do, because I think about abstract things. For me, abstract ideas are real deep and powerful things, which is why I guess I became a philosopher. But the problem with this is we need to understand God's claim to divinity. What is God's perfection? Is it unchangeability? Is it the perfect response to freedom of the will, which limits God's power and which gives us the capacity to be loving and human? And that with that freedom of the will, we can do things that God can't predict. And therefore, God can't know what we will decide and has to adjust afterwards. That is my view. The second, that freedom of the will makes God, in a Greek way, less than perfect, but in a Jewish way, completely perfect. And it's the only way that we can have our unique human quality. which is freedom of the will. So freedom of the will is a divine imposition on the divine, on the deity, on the Kadosh Baruch Hu, to limit God's knowledge. And that limitation, sort of like the mystical idea of Tzimtzum, that shrinking of God's complete power, gives us room to become human and to search out God in Heschel's phrase.
Marc, are you saying
that's why this is a very important part of the Torah.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry. Forgive me for interrupting you. Are you saying that God's perfection is that God sacrifices the ability to be indecisive because God defers it to human beings to have free will?
Exactly what I'm saying.
I just wanted to clarify it.
Right. In other words, God could have made us like bees or ants, where we have no free will and everything is perfect, everything works according to the common good, but we wouldn't be human if we did that. And that's the limitation of God.
So then the derivative is that a God who changes God's mind is perfect, and therefore a human that's in progress and changes their mind is also perfect.
Exactly right. And the downfall of what I would say thick, wonderful, deep, attractive Judaism, the downfall of it was the attempt to imitate Aristotle. And I'm always talking about Rambam and Aristotle, but it was a trap. It was a trap because it had a belief, which isn't true. It's just their belief that perfection and change are incompatible. What if they aren't incompatible? And the philosopher who figured that out was Leibniz, who argued convincingly, in my view, that this is the best of all possible worlds. Even with all the evil in it, giving us free will is such an overwhelming good, and it enables the most distinctive human traits to emerge, that a world with free will is better than a world without free will, even if it doesn't have evil.
Or Whitehead, who argued that this is a dynamic perfection, that perfection has to grow, that becoming is the category, not simply being, which is Aristotle's category. I got to tell you, forgive me for this, and it's a very generalized observation, but it strikes me listening to you, Marc, is that that both Moses and the God character drawn in this chapter are very masculine. And that this idea that
stereotype.
No, I know, but I'm doing it against type. That this idea that perfection is static, that perfection means you never change your mind, that authority is vested in the person who says, "That's what I said, listen to it," or "Because I'm your father, damn it," is so masculine. It's so masculine, and that somehow it's a diminishment of my masculine identity, my masculine authority, my fatherly authority in the house. If I say, "Oops, I screwed up," or "Teach me something I didn't know," or "Show me a different way to understand the circumstance," or "Maybe there was a better way to respond," which is something that all of us daddies and mommies have had to learn over the course of our parenting. But still, it seems to me such a masculine thing of, I will drive around the block for 4 hours rather than ask for directions.
Yeah, I agree, because it's authoritarian. And if you want to continue stereotyping, women are less authoritarian. Now, I know there's authoritarian women and there's sensitive men, and I admit all that, of course, that's true. But what you're right is, you're right. There are certain, I would say we've been culturally habituated to see men as authoritarian figures and women much more as nurturing figures. And I think the nurturing God, the God that Sherre refers to, who wants you to develop your own path of the millions and millions and billions of ways up the mountain to God, God wants you to develop your path. I think that is very powerful. And you can see it in a man. The only place I've seen it in a man is in the Buddha. That's a very strong tendency in Buddhism, that they ask his followers came to the Buddha and said, "Are you a god? Are you an idol? Can we worship you?" And he said, "No, I'm just a man, but I am awake. I am awake." And I think that's the goal of Judaism, to get people awakened to their own possibilities, to the capacity they have of finding each other and finding God.
Beautiful.
God, do we all agree on this?
I want to look at one more little piece before we conclude, because there's one more thing that happens in this Torah portion, which is remarkable. So the story proceeds that after the golden calf, Moses punishes the people. Actually, there's a slaughter of the bad guys in the story. And God moves Moses moves out of the camp, and God says, "I'm not going with you. I'll send an angel." And Moses appeals and says, "No, if you don't go, I don't go." And then God changes his mind again. And when that happens, Moses turns to God, and in an extraordinary episode, Moses says to God, "Who are you? Who are you?" Because great kings, as Marc has articulated, great kings, great authoritarian figures don't change their minds, at least not in public, not like this, not so drastically. And a God who's willing to say, "I forgive you. I'll let go of my rage. I'll let go of my blame and let you be the person you are meant to be." That kind of a God, that's a remarkable scene. It's just an absolutely remarkable scene. And what happens at that point is that Moses says to God, "Hareini et kvodecha." Let's go down just to the bottom here. Right? Moses comes down the mountain, he punishes the people, and then finally God forgives them. And this is a couple of chapters forward. Moses says to God, "You say to me, lead this people forward, but you've not made yourself known to me. You'll not know who will send with me. And you've said, I've singled you out. Now, if I've truly gained your favor, let me know your ways that I may know you and continue in your favor. Teach me who you are. Teach me your essence." And there's a very interesting exchange where Moses has an episode that we could feel it coming when he was speaking at the burning bush. And he kept asking God, "What's your name? What's your essence? Who are you? What is this God that I keep meeting?" And I can't help but think that what the tradition has done at this point is put into Moses, not Moses's question, but our question. Who is the God who inhabits this universe? And what is the ultimate principle by which this God governs reality? And who does this God want us to be in the end? Hareini et kvodecha, show me your essence, your presence, your glory. Show me who you are. And God says, "I can't, because I'm beyond you." The image is, "I can't let you see my face and live. I'll let you pass. I'll pass by you and you can see my back. You can see where I've been. And having seen where I've been, you'll understand who and what I am," which is such an intriguing idea of how one experiences divinity.
Yeah.
Please.
And in a way, what this is doing is it's replicating in Moses's life the golden calf incident in the lives of the people. They're saying, we need something visible to worship. The idea of worshiping an invisible God is just too hard for us. Well, Moses, at this pinnacle moment, is saying, look, I need it too. I need something visible too. I need to see you. I want to see you. And God has to remind Moses, what do you think the golden calf was about? It's the same as what you've just asked for. I can't let you see me and live. Meaning I'm an invisible being. I'm not visible. Or I'm visible, but I am consuming. I don't know.
Or I don't want you projecting your own inner weaknesses onto me.
That's nice.
Well, and it's funny that you saw it from Moses's point of view, because I saw it from God's point of view.
Which is?
That says about me. But God's just changed God's mind twice. And so Moses says to him, "Who are you?" And God's thinking, I got this role that I was supposed to play, but who I really am is just trying to figure it out. So I'm going to show you my back because I can show you what I've done, but I don't know who I'm becoming. So I can't show you my front because that's ahead of me. So I think it was more God struggling with, I know who I've been, but I don't know who I'm becoming. Let's figure that out together.
Sherre,
I was going to say it. That's the perfect foil to it.
I am becoming, and you can't nail me down to what I am because I am in process, as we all are. To nail somebody down at 1 second in 1 moment, to take a snapshot. Any snapshot you take becomes obsolete within the next seconds or so.
Yeah, so here's the ultimate question for me. Can you build a worldwide religion on the worship of an invisible God?
Well, let's give it a try. What do you say?
I was going to say, aren't we doing that?
And a God whose name you can't pronounce.
Yeah.
Both of those things we're doing.
There you go.
Well,
good morning. I want to wish everybody a very good morning. I want you to get on to Shabbos. So thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you to Rabbi Sherre and to Rabbi Marc, to my dear friends and teachers for sharing.
If you want to learn from me Monday, I'm at AJ teaching in a Bible interpretation class.
What time?
You got to tell that. You got to tell that.
AJU Biyachad is welcoming Rabbi Gellman teaching a class on interpreting the Bible, his wonderful Midrashim, which I have been teaching for years now. What time is it, Sherre?
So go to aju.edu. I believe it's at 2 p.m. Pacific. aju.edu. So yeah.
We'd love to have you. This coming, following our Torah study, of course, we welcome you to pray with us this morning. It's the bat mitzvah of Maytal Caldwell, a wonderful young woman with deep, deep thoughts. And then following that, this morning, we celebrate Rabbi Silverman's bar mitzvah. This is his bar mitzvah portion, and it's the 84th anniversary of his bar mitzvah. And his son, Jonathan Silverman, who's a worldwide movie star, is going to be joining us to read. He's going to read Rabbi Silverman's bar mitzvah speech from 84 years ago. So join us for that following our service this morning. This evening at 7 o'clock, we have Havdalah. It's at 7 tonight because we're moving it back each week. And that's Nina and me will be leading. Every morning, tomorrow morning, Sunday morning, 8:30 in the morning, every morning at 7:30 morning minyan, every afternoon at 5 until next week when we change the clocks. We change the clocks next week. That's the halacha. So this week it's still at 5, and next week we'll move it back to 6. This coming week, of course, lunch and learn on Wednesday afternoon at 12:30. We're continuing our romp through the books of Ketuvim. But my new series, The Questions That Won't Go Away, we began last week on Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock. And this week we're going to be continuing. And the question this week is, it has to do with believing in God. What does it mean, and what difference does it make to embrace a belief in God? So join us on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock on Zoom, on Facebook, or on YouTube. To Rabbi Gellman, to Rabbi Hirsch, thank you, and good Shabbos to everyone for joining.
Good Shabbos.